Alright guys, welcome to your 16th computer networking tutorial, and in this video I want to talk to you guys about the OSI model. Now the OSI model is something that confuses a lot of people, but it's actually an incredibly useful model if taught correctly for not only understanding how computer networks work, but also specifically how two computers communicate with each other. So if you had a hard time understanding, the big picture of computer networking and how everything was kind of, pieced together, what this model is going to do is not only give you a really good broad overview, but it's also going to take the individual pieces and clarify how each part works part by part. So what it does is it basically starts with the user experience, basically you looking at your computer, and it explains everything all the way down to when those electric signals are traveling across copper wire to another computer. So it does this in the form of layers. Now, this model calls, the different parts of it layers, but the layers in this model are basically just different pieces of how a computer network works. Now, like I said, it starts with, just your user experience, you looking at the computer, and the first layer is called the application layer. Now this is basically software applications. It's basically the user looking at whatever program they have running on the computer. Now this layer usually, involves things like Firefox, Google Chrome. Those are, probably the two biggest ones that users use whenever they're networking. And also, whatever program you use for email and stuff. It's basically software applications. This is the layer, again, like I said, closest to the user experience, software applications or programs. Now the next layer is called the presentation. The presentation layer. Now this is the layer that your operating system works on. Now what this does is it basically converts text that the user can understand, like letters and numbers. Because of course, whenever you type something into your email, you're typing, just basic letters and numbers, a language that you can understand. But that isn't the language that your computer can understand. Your computer, actually, one of the languages that understands is something called ASCII. And this is, we'll talk about different, languages and stuff like that later on. But this is basically a very simple language that your computer can understand because, it can't understand English like you can. It needs its own special thing. So that's what your operating system does in this layer. It converts text that the user can understand, like letters and numbers, to basically stuff that the computer can understand. And it just makes it more easy to work with the data when it's in this form right here. Now another thing that the presentation layer does is it also encrypts data, and whenever I say encrypts data, I mean put a special code on it so that hackers, just can't tap into it and steal your data, look, what you're sending it in your email and stuff like that. And we'll talk more about the presentation layer later on, but just remember right now that it's the layer that your operating system resides on. Now the next layer is actually the session layer. Now, if you're familiar with, like PHP programming or anything like that, then you already know what a session is. A session is pretty much a conversation between two computers. So what this layer does is, let me just go ahead and write conversation between two computers. So whenever computers are in the process of having a conversation with one another, we call this conversation a session. Now this layer is responsible for, starting and ending conversations or sessions, and it's also responsible for getting data from a website. So with this, say that you wanted to get data from a website, this layer would go ahead and create a session or start a conversation with a web server, and whenever, during the conversation, it would help maintain the communication. And if something, disrupted your communication, it would try to reestablish the link between it so, you guys could still communicate. And whenever it was done, this is the layer right here that is responsible for ending the conversation. So a session is basically like a conversation or communication between two computers, and this right here is responsible for pretty much starting, ending, and maintaining that conversation. Now the next layer I want to talk about is called the transport. the transport layer. And this, we'll talk about what packets are later on, but basically, let me give you guys a real, quick overview. And this is not the technical definition, so please, I don't want to get, 1,000 comments. A packet is pretty much like a chunk of data that you deliver from one computer to another. Whenever, you have an email and you want to send it to another computer, what your computer does is it breaks it up into smaller chunks of data just because it's easier for your computer to work with smaller chunks of data rather than one big one. So these chunks of data are actually called packets, and I sometimes use the word packet and frame interchangeably, but there is a difference. I'll talk about that later on. So basically, what this does is it ensures that packets, I'll just write packets, are delivered